you're standing knee-deep in a river. It's 40,000 years ago. The water is cold, your stomach is empty, and somewhere beneath the surface, a fish just brushed past your leg and vanished before you could even react. You have no rod, you have no line, you have no hook, just your hands, your patience, and a hunger that isn't going away on its own. This is the story of the single object that changed that forever, a tiny curved piece of shell that quietly became one of the most important tools our species ever created. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll never look at a fishing hook the same way again. And if stories like this are your thing, this is a good moment to hit subscribe because we're about to go back further than you think. Let's start with the obvious question. Before the hook existed, how did anyone catch a fish at all? The answer is messier and more violent than you'd expect. Early humans grabbed fish with their bare hands in shallow water. They used sharpened sticks to spear them. They built simple stone weirs, low walls in rivers that trapped fish as the water dropped. They even used their own woven baskets to scoop schools out of shallow pools. It worked sometimes. But it was inconsistent, exhausting, and completely dependent on being close enough to touch the water yourself. You couldn't fish from a distance. You couldn't fish in deep water. You definitely couldn't fish in the open ocean. For most of human history, the sea beyond the shoreline wasn't a food source. It was a wall. Then something changed. And the evidence for exactly when it changed comes from a cave most people have never heard of. In 2005, archaeologists were excavating a rock shelter called Gerimalai on the eastern tip of the island of Timor, north of Australia. What they found buried in the layers of that cave rewrote what we thought we knew about ancient fishing: thousands of stone tools, shell beads, and fish bones, an enormous number of them dating back an almost unbelievable 42,000 years. But here's the detail that stopped researchers cold. Nearly half of those fish bones belong to pelagic species. Tuna. Deep water fish that live far from shore in open water you cannot wade into, cannot spear from the bank, cannot trap in a shallow weir. Someone, 42,000 years ago, was catching fish that live in water too deep and too far away to reach by hand. Think about what that actually means. To catch a tuna, you need a way to get out onto open water. You need some kind of vessel. And you need a way to pull a fast, powerful, slippery animal out of the sea without falling in yourself. That is not an accident. That is not luck. That is technology. And inside that same cave, buried deeper in the layers, archaeologists found the proof. A small hook made from a shell, carefully shaped, smoothed, and curved by hand. Dated to somewhere between 16,000 and 23,000 years old, it is, as far as we currently know, the oldest fish hook ever discovered on Earth. Not a spear, not a net, a hook, deliberately carved to catch something that didn't want to be caught. Now here's where it gets even stranger. This wasn't an isolated invention. On a nearby island called Alor, less than 1,000 kilometers away, archaeologists uncovered something even more remarkable. 5 fish hooks, made from carefully shaped snail shell, placed gently under the chin and around the jaw of a woman buried roughly 12,000 years ago. Not tools left behind by accident. Tools placed there on purpose, as part of a burial. Someone believed this woman needed her fishing hooks in whatever came next. Fishing wasn't just survival to these people, it was identity. It was worth carrying into the afterlife. And that discovery quietly destroyed an assumption archaeologists had held for decades. For a long time, the working theory was that fishing, especially with hooks and lines, was primarily a male activity in ancient societies. A woman buried with fishing equipment, treated as valuable enough to take with her in death, forced researchers to rethink who actually did the fishing in the deep past. The sea, it turns out, didn't care who you were. If you could catch food from it, you mattered to your community. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. These hooks on Timor and Alor were not connected to some single genius inventor whose idea spread outward like ripples in a pond. Similar rotating hook designs, curved shapes with a narrow gap between the point and the shank, show up independently across the world, in Japan, in Australia, across parts of Arabia, in California, in Chile, in Mexico, across islands scattered throughout Oceania, different continents, different oceans, different peoples who never met, never traded, never shared a single conversation. And yet they arrived at almost the exact same solution. Researchers now believe this wasn't cultural copying. It was convergent invention. Different groups of humans faced with the same problem, staring at the same kind of fish, in the same kind of water, independently discovered the same answer. Which tells you something important about the human brain. Give it a real problem and enough time, and it will find the same elegant solution again and again, no matter where on Earth it happens to be sitting. So how do you actually go from nothing to a hook? Put yourself in that mindset for a second. You already know fish exist beneath the surface. You've grabbed a few by hand. If you were fast enough and lucky enough, you've noticed something else too. Sometimes a fish bites at something small and shiny that drifts past it in the current, a shell fragment, a curved bone, a twig caught in the flow. And every time it bites, its mouth closes around that object and doesn't easily let go. Somewhere in that observation is the entire idea of the hook, sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to notice it. The earliest hooks weren't even curved the way we imagine hooks today. Before the true hook, humans used something called a gorge, a small straight piece of bone or shell, sharpened at both ends and tied to a line at its center. You'd hide it inside bait. The fish would swallow it whole, and when you pulled the line taut, the gorge would flip sideways inside the fish's throat and lodge there, impossible to spit out. It's brutal, it's simple, and it works. Archaeologists have found gorges even older than true hooks, some estimated at close to 12,000 years old in various regions, evidence of an earlier, cruder stage in the same long chain of trial and error. From the gorge, the leap to a curved hook wasn't obvious. It took generations of small adjustments. Someone noticed that a naturally curved piece of shell or bone held its shape better than a straight one. Someone else figured out that if you left a small gap between the point and the shank, a fish could get its mouth around the bait, but couldn't easily slip back off the point once it bit down. Someone else worked out exactly how sharp the tip needed to be to pierce flesh without snapping. None of this happened in a single afternoon. It happened over centuries, passed from person to person, tested against real hungry stomachs and real slippery fish, refined a little more with every failed attempt and every fish that got away. And the materials themselves tell their own story. The earliest hooks were carved from shell, ground down slowly with stone tools until the curve was just right, a process that could take hours for a single hook. Later hooks were carved from bone, from antler, from turtle shell, whatever was strong, workable, and available nearby. Thousands of years later, in the region around what is now Israel, archaeologists uncovered something else entirely. A copper fish hook dated to roughly 6,000 years ago, over 6 centimeters long, heavy enough and strong enough that researchers believe it was built specifically to catch sharks or other massive fish. Not the small catches of a family meal, but something dangerous enough to need real metal behind the point. Fishing hooks had gone from delicate shell carvings, meant to feed one household, to serious engineered tools meant to pull enormous predators out of the sea. Around the same broad window of time, roughly 13,000 years ago along the banks of the Jordan River, archaeologists uncovered evidence that ancient people were doing something that sounds almost impossibly modern. Using lightweight lures designed to imitate insects, essentially an early version of fly fishing, thousands of years before anyone wrote a single word down. The idea that fly fishing might be over 13,000 years old should tell you everything about how sophisticated these early fishing cultures actually were. This wasn't primitive trial and error forever. Within a few thousand years, some communities had already turned fishing into something closer to a craft, understanding fish behavior well enough to trick them rather than simply overpower them. It's also worth pausing on just how much skill was hiding behind something that looks, at first glance, almost too simple to matter. Carving a hook out of shell isn't like whittling a stick. Shell is brittle. Push too hard in the wrong direction, and the whole piece shatters, and you're back to nothing. Hours of work gone in a single wrong movement. The curve has to be precise. Too tight, and a fish can't get its mouth around the point at all. Too open, and the fish slips free the moment it feels resistance. The point has to be sharp enough to catch flesh, but not so thin that it snaps the instant a big fish thrashes against it. None of this was written down anywhere. There were no diagrams, no measurements, no instructions passed along on paper. Everything was memory, muscle memory, and word of mouth. An entire body of specialized knowledge held together purely by people teaching other people, generation after generation, entirely by watching and doing. And once a design worked, it didn't stay still. Communities living near rivers built lighter, smaller hooks meant for quick, frequent catches close to shore. Communities relying on open ocean fishing, like the people on Timor pulling tuna out of deep water, needed something sturdier, a hook that could survive the weight and fight of a much larger, much stronger animal without bending or snapping the moment it hit real resistance. The hook wasn't one invention, it was hundreds of small local inventions, each one shaped by exactly what kind of water and what kind of fish a particular group of people happened to live beside. A hook built for a shallow, calm lake looks nothing like a hook built for the open Pacific. And both of them look nothing like the massive copper hook built for hunting sharks off the coast of the ancient Levant. Form followed function thousands of years before anyone ever wrote that phrase down. There's also a quieter story buried in all of this. One that's easy to miss if you're only looking at the hooks themselves. A fishing hook is useless without a line, and a line is useless without something strong enough to hold under tension without snapping the second a fish pulls back. That meant early fishing communities also had to master cordage, twisting plant fibers, sinew, or hair into something durable enough to survive a fight with a living animal underwater. That single requirement pushed forward an entirely separate branch of ancient technology, one that would later become essential for everything from clothing to shelter to eventually rope strong enough to bind together the first boats. The hook didn't just feed people, it quietly forced forward an entire toolkit of skills that ancient humans would end up needing for almost everything else they built afterward. So why does any of this actually matter? Why does a small curved piece of shell deserve this much attention? Because the hook did something almost nothing else in human history managed to do. It opened an entire new food source that had been sitting right in front of us the whole time, completely out of reach. Before the hook, the ocean and deep rivers were essentially useless to most communities beyond the shallows. After the hook, an enormous, constantly renewing supply of protein became available to anyone patient enough to sit by the water with a line. Fish don't need to be hunted across open plains. They don't need to be tracked for hours through the heat until they collapse from exhaustion. They don't fight back the way a bear or a bison does. A hook, a line, and patience could feed a family without a single spear ever being thrown. In places where fishing became reliable, populations grew. Settlements became permanent, instead of constantly moving in search of the next hunt. Some researchers even argue that stable fishing grounds were part of what allowed certain groups to settle down long before agriculture ever existed, sitting beside a good fishing spot generation after generation instead of chasing herds across the landscape. And once you see it this way, the hook stops looking like a small object and starts looking like a hinge point in human history. It's easy to talk about fire, about stone tools, about spears, when we picture the invention of civilization. But a curved piece of shell, carved by hand over countless quiet hours beside a river, fed people just as effectively, and asked for almost nothing in return except patience and a little bit of clever observation. Here's what's almost poetic about the whole thing. If you've ever gone fishing, on a lake, off a dock, on a boat, with a modern graphite rod and a spinning reel, you were doing something that connects you, in a very literal unbroken line, to someone standing on a riverbank 40,000 years ago, holding a hand-carved shell, watching the water, waiting for the smallest twitch that meant something below had taken the bait. The materials changed completely, the patience never did. The moment your line goes tight is the exact same moment that person felt, thousands of generations ago, in a world with no metal, no plastic, no engines, nothing but a shaped piece of shell, and the quiet hope that today, the water would give something back. So here's what I actually want to know from you. If you had absolutely nothing, no rod, no hook, no net, just your bare hands and a river full of fish, do you think you could figure out how to catch one before you starved? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to read what you come up with. And if you want more stories like this, pulled straight out of the deep, overlooked corners of human history, make sure you're subscribed because there are a lot more of them coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.